All right, so welcome back to part two of creating a new curriculum for the arts. Uh, this session is going to be slightly different, also because we don't have the editor here with us today. So instead, I'm going to introduce the editor of the next volume, which is Readings on Textiles. Abigail McGowan isn't here, but we will be showing a video presentation that she made for us for this seminar, followed by Mayank Mansingh Kaul fielding questions on behalf of the volume. So Abigail McGowan is a professor of art of history and associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, University of Vermont, USA. A historian of South Asian material culture in the late colonial period. She has published widely on craft development, the gendered politics of consumption, design history, textiles, domesticity, housing, retail, and domestic furnishings in India. Her current book, projects explore how changing ideas about home and domestic space have shaped the city of Bombay and how the iconic Bombay firm Kamdar Ltd traces a history of mid-century interior design in India. Mayank Mansingh Kaul is a New Delhi-based writer and curator with a focus on post-independence histories of textiles, design, and fashion in India. He is a graduate in textile design from the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad. Exhibitions that he has curated include the idea of fashion, fracture, Indian textiles, new conversations, gold, the art of Zari, Crossroads, Textile Journeys with Ritu Kumar, new traditions, influences and inspirations in Indian textiles, meanings, metaphor, handspun and handwoven in the 21st century, and Red Lilies, Waterbirds, the Sari in 9 stories. Kaul is the editor of Take on Art Design, Cloth and India Towards Recent Histories, Baluchari, Tradition and Beyond, and Take on Art Fashion, which looks at a century of Indian fashion through the narrative of personal histories. He is consulting editor, Architectural Digest India, and a member of the Advisory Council on Arts and Culture at the Asia Society. So, I'm gonna have Abigail here in digital format and in spirit. AV, I need help with sound.
No, no. Play करें? If you escape, sorry. Yeah, it's here. See.
Canon and the study of the arts in India. My presence here is Hi, my name is Abby McGowan. I'm very pleased to be with you, even if just remotely, and very pleased to be part of the conversation about creating a new curriculum for the arts. I'm also really pleased to be here to be talking about textiles and bringing textiles into that conversation, to think about how and where and how and if textiles might appear as part of the canon in the study of the arts in India. My presence here comes out of work I did with Marg to create the Readings on Textiles volume back in 2022 as part of the celebrations of 75 years of the magazine. I argued then, and I will argue now, that Marg made 3 signal contributions to the study of Indian textiles. First, Marg fostered deep appreciation of India's textile geographies and histories, with early articles on not just the famous Kashmiri embroidery on the bottom left of the slide, but also Punjabi Fulkari and Bengali Kanta, less well known at the time. That attention to wide geographies helped to broaden appreciation of the wealth, diversity, and particularly of the traditions and skills and styles of Indian textiles. Second, Marg has, since its founding, worked to bridge tradition and innovation. An early article, as you see here, from K.G. Subramaniam in 1962, for instance, posed exactly this as an objective, asking how to create new things out of the old, how to create contemporary designs out of handlooms in order to reconcile past and present. This was part of a refusal on the part of the magazine to see tradition and innovation in opposition. Instead, they were constantly asking how traditions had always been in development, how they could adapt to the present in new and compelling ways. That meant, among other things, regular attention then to those who were doing this work in couture, focusing on the ways in which transformational designers like Ritu Kumar and Rahul Mishra in embroidery, or Rahul Jain in minikar weaving, as you see on the right, were working to do new things within existing categories of work. Third and finally, Marg helped to get textiles recognized as arts. Titles of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay articles from the early days of the magazine show this directly. These titles of her articles were, again, Painting with a Needle, or Carpets Are Works of Art, staking her claim for attention to textiles right at the outset. Those articles were part of the magazine's efforts to establish textiles as just as worthy of serious scholarship and appreciation as the fine arts, explored through topics like Irwin's article on commercial embroidery of Gujarat in the 17th century, Gittinger's article on early Indian dyed cotton techniques, or Berenstein's articles on textiles discovered in Egypt. These are articles that appeared on the same pages of those on painting, on architecture and sculpture, establishing parity to those more familiar subjects. It's that attention to textiles as art that I want to highlight as a contribution to the conversation today. For all the good scholarship there is on textiles, and there's lots, it doesn't always find a secure home in the art curriculum, which again is more comfortable with sculptures and painting and architecture. So part of what I want to do is to argue for a place of textiles among the arts as a topic worthy of study, as central to the art curriculum, not just for designers looking for inspiration and for historical roots, but as a way into the past, a way of understanding aesthetic practices and achievements taken on its own terms. That's the inclusionary side of what I'm doing. I want textiles brought into the fold, so to speak, to have a seat at the table. But if I want textiles to be considered as art, I also want to use textiles to rethink the category of art, to encourage us to think not about art as a singular thing, but the arts as a pluralistic category, with room for both extraordinary objects of contemplation, but also everyday objects of use, more mundane things. Centering textiles allows us to think about that pluralistic category, but also to bring new approaches and questions to the fore. As you'll see in what follows, centering textiles means turning our attention away from genius producers and towards a focus on products in context. Indeed, studying textiles involves asking questions about the technologies of production, about how different tapestries developed for cotton weaving in Andhra Pradesh on the left, or twill tapestry weaving in Kashmir on the right, came to be. Studying textiles also centers communities of users, bringing the people who bring meaning to objects into the story. This might mean courtly settings in the Mughal era, where gifting, wearing, and possessing shawls imbued them with value, or it might mean thinking about the modernizing middle classes of the late 19th century, where certain women started to experiment with new ways of wearing saris to explore their modern identities, as these images shows. Focusing on textiles also means paying attention to the centrality of markets and trade, not just because we have good example for that trade in visual culture through colonial area textile labels and the post-independence advertisements you see here, but also because we're used to and really good at thinking about textiles in trade terms. We're comfortable with textiles as commodities because trade in textiles was so central to the rise of the English East India Company and British rule. Finally, focusing on textiles brings out the vital links between the present and the past, links that connect, for example, the Coromandel Coast Palampur from the early 1700s made for the Sri Lankan market on the left side of your screen to the 2016 example on the right made by a contemporary kalamkari artisan, both of which are exploring the tree of life motif. Or to give examples from brocade, links that can help us find a through line between the brocades made in the 1880s or the Art Nouveau inflected 1930s on the upper right, or the example from the 1980s, all of which you see here. You simply can't talk about textiles without questions about technologies, users, markets, and the link between innovation and tradition. They are central to the story. And of course, it's not that these same issues don't come up in the study of temple architecture, modernist design, or the other fine arts. But I would argue that they're easier to prioritize, to move to the center of conversation in textiles, which is part of what I think makes the study of textiles so valuable. They allow us to center different approaches. Okay, so if part of what I want to do is make the case for why we should study textiles, I also want to offer some suggestions on how you bring textiles into the story of the arts. Including textiles in an art curriculum is a daunting task, given the sheer variety and historical depth of Indian textiles. There are simply so many different technologies in weaving and dyeing and printing and embellishment that have taken so many different styles and modes across India. Again, it's daunting. I would argue that we can find through lines by which we can forge a common narrative out of that diversity while also allowing for the richness of individual traditions. Specifically, I would argue we do that by focusing on four main themes, which I'll move through in turn quickly, I promise. These are markets, innovations, intersections, and then fourth and finally, politics. Okay, I'll start with markets because that's perhaps the easiest and because I've also already gotten us started in this direction. One way to think about a common narrative in Indian textiles is by thinking about a commonly structured market, not a unified market by which all things were available in all parts of the subcontinent, but instead a commonly structured market with common layers of movement. At one layer, commonly across all parts of India, there's production for local use, for sale, for barter, for personal consumption. Three examples on the screen would be rush weaving in Nagaland, backstrap loom weaving in Ladakh, or spinning on a charkha in Karnataka. These tends to produce rougher, more utilitarian textiles for everyday use, things to rush mats to keep water off you, or everyday textiles to use, made by people themselves, or for folks nearby. Second, in addition to this, again, local use for production by local people, would be regional production done on a speciality basis. And again, I'll give you some examples. So in these two pieces of mochi embroidery made about 1850, you have examples of Kutchi high-end textiles produced for wealthy consumers across Western India. They weren't intended for markets just in Kutch itself. There's lots of other examples by which particular weaves and patterns might be intended for a particular caste group or community, either nearby or far away. So the patola on the left is generally used by the Ismaili Muslim Vora community, and the one on the right is a Kalakshetra sari. That's a modern version of what would have signified nationalist sentiments in the early 20th century. Third and finally, you have specialized production for farther afield markets, overseas. Some of these could be pretty utilitarian in terms of the printed cottons that we found most famously and most in our earliest examples also that were discovered in Egypt, representing Indian trade to that region between the 12th and the 15th centuries. These are examples that in the examples you have on the screen go from the very simple plain patterned single colored on the left to the much more intricately patterned and many different dyes involved in the bottom right. So again, if these are textiles that link India to markets in Egypt and the Near East, we also have, going the wrong direction. We also have finer and more elaborate textiles. These, for example, were patola silk weaves that were made for markets in Southeast Asia. These were textiles that were highly prized in the courts and used for ritual purposes. And again, patolas were stitched into trousers, as the example on the right that was stitched around 1900 is. And then the left detail and then the large, which is a section of the large garment across the top, is a shoulder cloth that would have been woven in Gujarat specifically for the demands of the Indonesian market. And then if we're thinking about overseas markets, there's of course the most famous example to most of us are the elaborate printed cottons that were central to the trade from India to Europe and then obviously on to the Americas as well. These included fabrics that were done in all kinds of colors and styles and intended for men's garments. The upper left is a men's robe meant for the Dutch market. For dress fabrics, so long lengths of fabric that would have been cut up and stitched into the dress made for the British market in the bottom left. And then the large sets of fabric that would have come as a complete whole. So there's a printed bed cover, there's a wall hanging behind, and then curtain fabrics that would have been stitched up for the bed on the right. These were all, if we're thinking about regional and global markets, there's several distinguishing features of them. First they were differentiated. So if we go back to this mochi example again, these are intended, the fabric on the top and the bottom are for different purposes. The top would have been stitched for a skirt. And you can see that the top is left undecorated, so that would have been where the waistband would have been, and the bottom border would have been at the feet. The bottom piece of fabric, by contrast, was part of what would have been made into an apron. So again, differentiated by use, what they would have been made and purposed for, but also differentiated by in terms of community. The bottom fabric was specifically intended for a Parsi audience and a Parsi consumer, whereas the top had a probably wider audience. If these were markets that were differentiated, these were also markets that were mediated. Indian block printers didn't travel to what is now Egypt or later to Europe to investigate their markets, but instead they relied on complex strings of merchants and intermediaries to communicate what was needed and then gather and move goods to consumers. Goods that were, again, highly variegated in terms of colors, patterns, and the possible uses they would have been put to. Finally, these are markets that were highly dynamic. In terms of changes in what specific things were produced, puts into markets, used, and then also valued. Again, we're probably most familiar, many of us, with the dramatic changes in dress in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a time when regional courts are declining under British rule, disrupting courtly demand for fine textiles. Trade patterns were shifting under imperial trading rules and preferences, and again, imports. And also styles were changing, again, as this example points to, with the influence of European fashions and ideas of modesty, pushing both the new styles of sari wearing, which I showed you before, but then also the examples on the right of women who were taking up entirely Western clothes. So again, if the markets were highly dynamic because of taste and the change in consumption patterns, they're obviously changed by new technologies also. And this is most famously and politically the introduction of industrial mill cloths, which pushed handlooms out of many markets, offering cheaper goods in brighter colors and new combinations, both from European mills, whose labels you see on the left, as well as from the emerging Indian textile mill industry, whose labels are on the right, from Bombay and Ahmedabad mills in particular. Okay, I want to lean into that market dynamism for a minute to get us to our next topic, which is innovations. And again, it's usually easiest to think of adaptations to markets in terms of design innovations. For instance, Indian cottons took off in Europe not just because they represented some of the best weaving and coloring technologies in the world, although that obviously mattered a lot, but also because producers quickly introduced particular patterns and colors suited to European markets. Ones that brought European motifs like the cornucopia you see in this detail, and that adapted Indian color palettes, which would have been a much heavier and richer set of colors, into this much more muted color scheme meant for European taste. You can also see that innovation and the commitment to change over time as tastes, materials, and economics developed. Thus, the fashion that drives the dress on the right from the 1740s is different from what drove the one on the left from the 1770s. There's slight differences in the patterning, there's differences in the colors used, there's differences in the amount of fabric used, possibly also in the weight of the fabric used, all of which would require producers to make changes to what they were doing and adapt over time. These adaptations, of course, were not just to changing European tastes, but also addressed consumers in other areas. So again, just as patola weavers were developing designs suited to tastes in Southeast Asia and adapting what they would have made for producers and consumers rather in Gujarat in Western India, other people adapted to the changing demand for patola in Southeast Asia. So here's an example of a cotton fabric that was actually printed with patola-looking designs, meant for the Southeast Asian market in order to capture folks who couldn't afford the authentic patola woven in silk. So again, innovation in products trying to chase markets and changing tastes far overseas. As interesting as these design changes though, innovations were never purely visual. There are also important developments in terms of technologies. And again, as we're centering technologies here, as we're more used to thinking about handmade textiles as archaic, conservative, or unchanging, when in fact these were cutting edge things for their eras. They were the best of their time, representing knowledge that was coveted by both consumers and producers around the world. And they were never static. These technologies evolved, updated, and adapted to new conditions and markets. I'll give you a couple examples of the technological innovation. The first being the introduction of a new kind of dye stuff and the use of a new kind of dye stuff over time. Matabel Gittinger traces out, for instance, the emergence in the 17th century of a new way of applying indigo in the Coromandel area. Rather than requiring the submersion of an entire textile in an indigo vat, the new technique allowed artisans to apply just small amounts of indigo dye directly to individual sections of cloth. Here that would be the blue of Ram's body in the top textile on the right, or the blue-green highlights in the ladies' dresses in the bottom. You can also see innovation in weaving techniques. Velvet weaving, for instance, took off under the Mughals in response to courtly demands, while Assamese weavers adopted a new lampas weaving technique around the 16th century. This was closely associated with Vaishnavite devotional practice, as you can see from the Krishna imagery in the textile on the right. And again, rose in the 16th century and then disappeared and died out again by the 19th century. Again, further innovation of a different kind. Okay, these two examples then bring us to the next theme, which is intersections. Innovations in designs or dyes didn't happen independently as a series of entirely separate strands of development, but instead they emerged out of complex intersections within South Asia from one region to another, but also connecting South Asia out to the wider world. Movements of people are probably the most obvious part of this intersection. If we think about the traders who might have been moving in this Arab dhow that we have pictured from, early print republished in 1883, the idea that the traders who are moving back and forth are bringing ideas and they're helping to connect physically and materially people from one place to the other. But artisans themselves were also in motion and moving. Artisans moved from one town to another in search of patronage. Artisans moved from one area to the other as conditions changed. Both traders and artisans brought new ideas with them when they moved. They brought techniques. Again, the velvet weaving I was just mentioning that grew popular under the Mughals came largely from Persia. Lampas weaving that came to Assam was likely learned from weavers in Bengal. But other things were in motion and were intersecting in this period too, including styles of dress. So shawl styles, for instance, I showed examples of shawl wearing from northern India before. These also traveled very thoroughly across South India. So the examples of Bijapur, Coimbatore, or the ruler of Golconda on the right shows the ways in which shawl sort of strategies and styles that were popular in North India are traveling across the subcontinent. Aside from moving geographically through space, ideas also moved as well. Motifs from temple walls or mosque architecture, for instance, were translated into fabric, or to give another example, moved from paintings into textiles, as we can see in the 17th century Mughal carpet, where the images that I have as the blow-ups here of hunting scenes of animals, etc., are very similar to the ones that we see from miniature painting from just the same era. So again, ideas and motifs moving from paintings into textiles one way or the other. And then, of course, they're moving the other direction. Mughal paintings luxuriate in fine textiles. They're given enormous attention and detail and really pride of place in composition. As you can see in this page from the Pajanama, where it's not just the attention to what individual people are wearing, but it's attention to the textiles of the elephant trappings and the horse trappings and the flags and other things. And then finally, bringing it full circle, fabrics themselves display more fabrics. So this is a rumal from the Coromandel coast from the 17th century with the inset on the right, showing the way in which the textile shows people wearing textiles and the diversity of textiles that might have displayed sort of princely authority or courtly life, etc. And again, I'm stressing these intersections to highlight that when we're talking about textiles, we're also always talking about movements and mobilities, including goods moving over through space, spheres of influence with styles moving across Asia over time, and spheres of media influence by which paintings and temples and mosques and textiles interact with one another. That then brings us to our fourth and last then theme, which is politics. Because of course, mobilities of goods, peoples, and styles were never frictionless. Things never move universally, and they never move to all people in all places and all time. Indeed, textile markets and innovations and intersections all had their politics, by which gifting fabrics to particular people helped incorporate them into rule through what's known as robes of honor. There's a very famous photograph of a Mahmud of Ghazni receiving a robe of honor. By which a major part of kinship was to attract the finest producers and products. That's what makes these attention to fabrics in these Mughal paintings, another example from, again, the Padshah-nama. The attention to textiles in these is not indulgent, it's not just trying to show off, but instead it's a form of political accounting, noting the power and the wealth concentrated at court. Politics also involves controlling resources, and the supply, by which the supplies of important textiles marks command of the economy and the global trade. Again, that was what makes the English love of chintz not just a style, but a way of expressing imperial ambitions and experiences in the world. And finally, there's a politics by which demanding changes to dress in certain contexts offered a way to enact particular and popular expectations for behavior or ideas of self. Again, this is what makes these new sari and dress styles part of a struggle to define appropriate femininity and modesty and modernity in a moment of great cultural change. The politics of cloth during the anti-colonial movement built on these politics of patronage and economic power and morality and personhood, so that when Gandhi takes up khadi, he's able to turn it into such a potent weapon because textiles were already powerful. Economically, they were powerful as commodities central to profits and trade. Symbolically, they were powerful as expressions of authority and productive rule. Personally, they were powerful as intimate expressions of and means to alter identities. Gandhi was, of course, never the only one to wield the politics of cloth. Leaders after independence continued to build on it, using patronage of artisanship to make claims about cultural heritage and India's distinct place in the world. Indira Gandhi very famously wore her handloom saris as political statements, as a means of asserting claims to Indian culture and identity. And she wore them around the world. She wore them in her meetings with statespeople. She wore them in order to, again, display that sense of what it meant for her to be Indian. And obviously many others have continued to do the same, using textiles to make their own statements and claims in the world in ways that are deeply and inherently political. Okay, by way of conclusion, I want to bring us back to the cover of the readings on textiles to make yet another pitch for attention to textiles within this new curriculum for the arts. As I hope I've argued, studying textiles helps to center stories of technologies, stories of communities of use, stories of the importance of markets and consumers and commerce. These are not the dirty secrets of the arts, but in fact, they're the motivating and animating structures behind them, as well as the links between the present and the past. There are many, many stories here that link out both to every part of India, but also to all kinds of Indians, producers and consumers, designers and traders, patrons and promoters. And so I encourage you to think about how these links center textiles in the stories of India's arts, and how we can think about a new curriculum that can make sure textiles are seen and placed at the center of that story. So thanks so much for your time. I hope the conversations are fruitful and stimulating, and I only wish I could be there in person.
It's great to have you here to be able to help me with this. Not easy, I can tell you. It takes a great historian to be able to position the material as Abigail did, to look at it so widely, and to be able to say why textiles really needs greater attention in the social sciences in India. It intersects with all of the social sciences really so intimately. If you think about the history of agriculture and agricultural economics, if you think about the histories of labor, if you think about the histories of the entire Indian political movement and the freedom movement, and the state subsidies, national policy, all kinds of things apart from what the issues that Abigail herself has raised in her presentation, it is too central for us to not be able to contend with the matter of textiles adequately in the curriculum. So how are we going to do it? And like with all of the arts that we've dealt with, the issue is that they all demand so much subject immersion first to be able to know the materiality of each of these things, whether it was temple art and architecture, where you have to know your iconographic systems and types of temples, so whether we were looking at the forms of dance and the regional variety, and then once you're immersed in the body of the tradition, then to be able to historically position it and to do that. So it's, I don't know what you feel, your own trajectory has been similar, right? It was absolutely from practice and making to now curating it. Is there any other way of learning the field? Is there any other way of doing it? Do you have to get at it from that kind of knowledge?
I think all of what you've said, all aspects of the field have to work together. So when you look at, I think two things stand out in Abigail's approach to developing this curriculum. One is that, of course, she looks at all of the aspects that we may typically look at, which is influences, aesthetics, patronage and politics, technology, and then the market. But then she also kind of, she places them and references to them across periods. So, I think the first thing that kind of strikes you is that she's not falling prey to typical art historical frameworks that scholars like you and in Deepti's presentation will encounter.
Yeah.
That you're not fighting this kind of looking at things purely chronologically, or for that matter, through the prism of religions like Buddhist textiles or Islamic textiles. So I think there's this kind of great distance with which she looks at the subject, and without falling prey to what could be very typical, references or anchors that she could borrow from art history, typical or previous approaches to looking at art history. So I think all of us in the field have found this great, very refreshing distance with which she looks at the subject, which we've discussed is in contrast to some of the other editors who've looked at publications on textiles for Marg, whether it's Laila Tyabji, practitioner, Jasleen, practitioner, or for myself, for that matter, myself, I guessed edited one of the issues, and again, coming from the practice. So I think all of this needs to have a conversation with each other. I think that's not happening. So I think that's the only way to look at.
But in terms of learning, that's very helpful. Thank you for putting it like that. But when we train people in the field, it's impossible to really get into the field of Indian textiles without really having some exposure to practice, I find. Is it enough? What would be the bare minimum you would imagine in terms of exposure to practice that is really required? How just familiarity of touching and looking at samples and knowing, having sample sets, how does one do this practically?
Yeah, for instance, I can speak from the kind of education that we received at NID. We had to spend a lot of time at museums and looking at material. As closely as possible. And I think today technology has advanced to such a level that conservators can really look at fiber, things at very minute levels, so you can really go down to that. Often a lot of earlier approaches to textiles which look at, say, motifs, aesthetic influences, they do not deal with questions of materiality. And I think, you may find a peacock on a particular textile that may be, two textiles, similar motive on two textiles which have been produced in very different geographical locations.
Absolutely.
The minute you look at the weaving, you suddenly realize that actually they're not from the same region. So, there is a lot of possibility today with conservation and that kind of technical advancement to study textiles.
Textile technology.
Yeah, and I think it's really depends on the level of a student's interest or a person who's engaging with the material. So I typically came from, my interest as a person who was trained in a certain kind of design in India, really was to first look at how the aesthetics have evolved or how that they have mirrored the socio-political, economic, changes in India. But at some point, I encountered the difficulty that when I was looking at something like, say, khadi that I was being told was from Bengal, or on the other hand, from Deccan, I actually had to look into things very deeply to really try and start making suggestions of what
What
maybe
the yarn
difference
tells you
is,
and
yeah,
what
what
the
the yarn
weave
tells you. Yeah, so I think I encountered that difficulty and I realized the futility or the limitations of only looking at things from the aesthetics.
Right.
And I had to get it. So I think everyone may have their own trajectory.
Right. No, I only wanted to signal this because this is a issue that we are all confronted with. At some point, the exposure to the making or the materiality of the things that we are looking at, that we are theorizing, that we are writing into histories of economics or histories of history, histories of geography or doing historiographies of these things. Do we have other suggestions or questions? Or, yes, please.
I'm a bit hesitant to be the first one to jump in again. I'm doing some work on materiality and modernity. I'm doing some work on materiality and modernity in textiles. And one thing that has sort of come to my attention, which is not covered in a presentation like this, is the kind of work that is being done, of very large embroidered panels or very large embroideries that are on display at, for instance, the art fair. I'm thinking in particular of the panels done by Madhvi and
Manu
Parekh,
yes.
and how they served as the backdrop, not on the garments, but as the backdrop to the fashion show of Dior in Mumbai. And I'm contrasting that with a very similar Dior fashion show in Mexico City, which had a very, I don't know if you've seen this, but they had a very, very different feel. The one in Mexico was paying homage to the embroidery of the various regions of Mexico and a huge homage to Frida Kahlo, etc. And how, by contrast, the panels done in India were really just an advertisement for designers of Italy or Paris to come to India to get cheap embroidery done, which kind of is not just offensive, that's just a moral stance, but what would you say to this trend in the market?
I think the organizers of the particular incident that you're talking about were vigilant about precisely this representation. They tried to prevent this very representation of the work because I think these issues had been, in this case, signaled to Dior right at the very outset that there would be such an approach and a reception and a critique of their work in India. They were informed that they must not fall necessarily prey to this. I think there was discussion around this issue, even at the inception of the project. But I think that's a separate, again, issue. That's an issue about the representation of a particular kind of cultural production in a world market, and the space of where you position the mediation between a fashion house on a global stage, Indian modern artists, traditional Indian embroidery, and the embroiderers agency, and all of those issues that come up in a network. And how do you think about such networks in the contemporary? Now, given the fact, yes, please.
Just because I was somewhat familiar with what happened with your show, because what did I do? I moderated a press conference there. The embroideries that were made were actually to, Mayank, you might know this, what is that studio called?
The
in
microphone,
Bangalore?
please just.
The Chanakya Studios. To showcase the Chanakya
Mike.
Studios embroideries, not just their skills, but also their school which they have there. Those tapestries, well, they weren't called, they're embroideries, they're not tapestries, were shown in the Paris fashion show as backdrops. And they were shown in Bombay at an exhibition of art. Now, I think that Abigail's presentation actually addressed all of this. What is the function? Like, you know, we're talking about function. What is art? How do we bring the idea of textiles into the definition of art as such? And that's something that people have been doing now for a while. I'm a little nervous about doing that. And when, you know, what is this word art, which makes it necessary for everything to be dumped into it? Each thing has its own value. And I think that's what the Chanakya studio was trying to do, to show the value of embroidery itself. And because the person who runs the studio is you know, loves Madhvi and Manu's work, yes, she thought it would be a good idea to blow these up into embroideries with the collaboration of the artists. It's not like they were left out of the whole process. They kind of followed the process of embroidery right through. So I think, and also, I mean, you contrasted it to the Mexico situation. The current director of Dior, who is also their main designer, has been using the work of practicing artists in many countries. And she's usually just, you know, taken the works of artists and asked them to do specific works or, you know, stuff like that for I think 6 or 7 of their shows, their recent shows. So I don't think here it was a snub to or an exotifying of India.
Thank you. I think the main issue that we are trying to also talk about is that a lot of the arts function for the sake of markets. Yeah. And across the board, we have come to understand a lot of changing definition for the rarefied space for what an artwork must occupy, and the space that the respect and the kind of habitat in which we want to position something as an artwork. And I don't think that that's the larger economy in which the culture industries work. And a lot of the people who come out of a design practice, which we call, or in an applied art practice, you're producing aesthetically minded, artistically informed practice for markets. And you're governed by, and you are producing it for the sake of, for very consciously thinking about markets as well. So labor and market are not matters that can be separated from the whole question about where the creative industries go, as it were, in South Asia or anywhere in the world. Yeah. And carry on.
No, unless. I think one, very specifically to clarify, the reader is based on the archives of Marg. So it's also looking at, Abigail is also accessing 75 years of the archive. And I think we need to remember that. So there may be things, you know, that may have been missed out in terms of content or references, because she's looking at the material and then trying to contextualize it. 2 lessons or 2 takeaways. The Asia Society, which curated this exhibition of Manu and Madhvi Parikh's textiles, executed by the Chanakya School. So I'm involved with the Asia Society, and I had I could closely observe the response to the show. And what was really interesting was that a lot of students came to the exhibition. And what they shared was that they found the exhibition a very different entry point into understanding what is craft than what is typically conveyed to them or is analyzed, right? So for them to actually be in a space to look at this kind of material being produced by craftspeople who are full-time employees of a big company, they're getting PPF, they're compliant completely, is a very different idea of a craftsperson compared to the typical way in which the craft sector is often conveyed to them at a student level. So I think that was one really interesting observation. And secondly, I think that the fact that they chose to bring that entire exhibition, it was a very big exercise, along with the fashion runaway show, also conveys an ethos that the creative director kind of follows in all of these countries. She has almost a 30-year relationship with Chanakya International. What that also did, now it's become almost impossible for ateliers like Chanakya or big brands like Dior not to credit who's producing. So that was another very interesting. As much as I agree there was a lot of controversy, there was debate, it's kind of made this idea that you have to recognize your producers almost necessary for most international brands. So I think from that perspective, it was also a very important moment. Accepting all the other kind of layers of conversation that it generated. So these are some thoughts.
Anyone else on? Well, I have been discussing with my colleagues for some time that we desperately and urgently need to work textiles into the curriculum in a more integrated way somehow. And finding ways to do that has been proving exceptionally difficult.
It is, yeah.
How do we get it? Because it's such an integral part of the social sciences actually as a material. So when we in history study any primary source material to be able to write your PhD on it, you're taught, how to engage with epigraphy of a particular period, copper plates of a particular period, the source material, whatever your source material is for your doctorate. So how are we going to create pedagogues who will allow students to get immersed? The reason I was asking you those questions about at what stage do we start familiarizing people who are going to write up textile histories into the actual materiality of what they have to deal with and how they're going to do it? Has been an ongoing battle for us to think about how we're going to find the time, space, and ways in the curriculum to be able to achieve that. There's a question here, yeah.
Actually, it's not a question. I just wanted to add a few thoughts to what you said. When you talked about how do we slip in, we've been talking about how to introduce textiles. Textiles are taught at NID, they are taught at NIFT, and in the 5,000 institutions of design across the country. But they don't
5,000?
Yeah, if not more. From the small one-room places to the large ones, because now there are 18 NIFTs in itself, 5 NIDs, and they're just burgeoning, is that they don't, as you said in the beginning yourself, it is embodied knowledge that they teach, and they don't want to know words and history and geography. But when I studied, I've been a long-term subscriber to Marg. So when I studied the volume on the temples and the volume on dance, what was missing was the fact that dance requires costume. It requires textiles. Every form requires its own textiles. There is no temple that you go to even now where gods aren't dressed. There are textiles everywhere in temples. Textiles are donated to temples. Why is it that it doesn't slip in
Yeah.
into the existing curriculum.
Yeah.
That was number one.
Yeah.
My second thing that I wanted to say is, you asked a question on how important is practice, and in the knowledge of learning about textiles, don't we need to look at how things are made? And we are so fortunate that in our country, we still have, while we have innovation, contemporary, modern, new, nothing has stayed still, many of our practices continue to be proto-historic. So when you even read archives of the 1800s, 1700s, and 50s, when you read about the whole process of kalamkari, it is being reproduced till now. So it is available. We are in a country where we have, a student can just take a long drive or take a flight and see it for themselves. So I just wanted to speak very, very.
May I
Thanks.
quickly respond to that?
Please. Yeah, do.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing that. So out of those 5,000, we here are part of one institution where I have been now teaching for more than 3 decades. I started with a course, painting, sculptures, and architecture to use as inspiration for designing costumes, fashion, looking at motifs, prints, patterns, printed, painted, embroidered mythology on textiles, which was taught as a part of a course to fashion and textile students. At present, we have courses which are called cultural studies only for textile students to understand the cultural aspects of textiles as part of society, mythology, religion, politics, as well as historical narratives, which not only covers history of fashion and costumes, but different regional motifs and things by which they become familiar with identifying and getting, sort of really seasoned into just looking and saying, of course, this is a weave and this is a pattern, or this is patola, or this is a Hans from South India, or whatever it is.
Right.
So it is very unfortunate, and Naman, you might remember we worked together on the NCRT 11th and 12th, 10th book
Textbooks.
on art. And at every point, there has been an added part of it in the course curriculum as well as the national course curriculum. But it is unfortunate it's not coming to the extent it should. And just one more thing before, because I don't want to stop the flow. These books have been such a great teaching material for people like me, who have used these to identify the trajectory. We cannot forget the past. We start from these books and then try to trace and lead the students to look for what's happening today. So if I'm looking at something from dance or architecture in the past, these are absolutely great compendiums. And I mean, we have sets in the library for that reason, though I have my personal sets. So that's what I wanted to add, that the whole idea is that exciting myself to begin with, Marg, has been a great, a first baby step into understanding more scholarly writings for me. This is just an honest opinion I wanted to share with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. That
just,
was very nice and very encouraging. It is.
I just wanted to actually respond to what you raised earlier. The fact that we don't have a single formal course or curriculum, formal program for Indian textile history is a big gap. But I think it has also, we have to also see there are references. So if you look at almost the 24 publications that the Calico Museum has done, it can be seen as a certain kind of pedagogy which is based on a collection. Devi Art Foundation now has, done 6, 7 exhibitions on textiles. So I think, you have institutes like NID and NIFT that have an active program of craft documentation. So there are references. It's just that I think a lot of them are not in conversation with each other to the extent that we would like. And I think that the biggest opportunity we have in not having a single kind of curriculum, already established curriculum for Indian textile history, is that it allows us to accommodate all of these perspectives, including personal histories, and to think about all of these things together. Also to raise the question of what is research? Is research just, technical? Does it come from practice? As you've raised earlier. So I think it's both in perhaps suggesting a curriculum, we may be solving some issues, but we may also create some new, and we have to be aware of that. So I think this is both a limitation and an opportunity.
Yeah, so something's got to get done, and I think that's why the diversity of opinions and stakeholders working in the field in different capacities is very useful. So thank you for that. Let's carry on to the next one.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Naman.